The boardroom fell silent as Marcus slammed the contract onto the mahogany table, his hands trembling with rage. 20 years of friendship, 20 years of trust, and it all came crashing down in this single moment when he discovered what his business partner had been doing behind his back. But this story doesn't start here. It starts 3 months earlier, when I was the weakest version of myself, drowning in loneliness and watching everyone around me succeed while I remained invisible, powerless, and forgotten. My name is Marcus, and I was that guy everyone overlooked. The one who said yes to everything, who let people walk all over him, who believed that being nice would somehow magically transform his life into something meaningful. I worked at a mid-level marketing firm where my ideas were constantly stolen, my contributions ignored, and my presence treated like background noise. Every morning felt like walking into a battlefield where I was armed with nothing but good intentions. Then came the night that changed everything. I was browsing through old philosophy books in a dusty corner of the library when I stumbled upon a worn copy of Machiavelli's writings that someone had left behind. As I read those pages, something clicked inside my mind. The Prince wasn't just about political power. It was about understanding human nature, about recognizing that the world operates on influence, strategy, and calculated moves. If you're finding value in this story, please hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences with transformation, and subscribe for more content that dives deep into life-changing psychology. The first principle I learned was this: people respect strength, not kindness. Not cruelty, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth and refusing to let others diminish it. I started small. When my colleague David tried to take credit for my campaign proposal during the Monday meeting, instead of staying silent like usual, I spoke up with calm, undeniable facts. David's face went pale as I methodically laid out the timeline of my work, the email timestamps, and the original drafts that bore my signature style. The room shifted, and suddenly I wasn't invisible anymore. But this was just the beginning. The real test came when I discovered that my business partner, someone I'd trusted for years, had been systematically undermining me while pretending to be my closest ally. James and I had built our consulting firm from nothing. We'd shared dreams, struggles, and countless late nights planning our future. I thought our friendship was unbreakable, but I was about to learn how naive that belief was. It started with small inconsistencies. Clients mentioning conversations I'd never had, projects being redirected without my knowledge, and financial discrepancies that James always had reasonable explanations for. The Machiavellian principle I'd learned was to never reveal your suspicions until you have irrefutable proof. So I began documenting everything, building my case like a detective gathering evidence for the crime of the century. What I discovered shattered my understanding of human nature. James had been secretly meeting with our biggest clients, convincing them that I was unreliable, that he was the real talent behind our success. But the betrayal went deeper. He'd been preparing to push me out of my own company, using my trust against me, manipulating every situation to position himself as the indispensable partner. The old Marcus would have confronted him emotionally, would have pleaded and argued and ultimately lost everything. But Machiavelli had taught me that timing and strategy matter more than righteous anger. I spent 2 weeks preparing my countermove. I reached out to our clients directly, not to badmouth James, but to demonstrate my value through results and genuine relationship building. Meanwhile, I documented every instance of James's deception, every forged signature, every unauthorized decision he'd made, while claiming to act in the company's best interest. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning. James walked into our office with his usual fake smile, completely unaware that I'd already spoken to our lawyer and prepared for every possible response he might give. When I laid out the evidence, his confident facade crumbled like a house of cards. The man who'd been manipulating me for months suddenly looked like a cornered animal, desperate and exposed. He tried every manipulation tactic in the book. First denial, then anger, then attempts to guilt me about our friendship, and finally desperate bargaining when he realized I held all the cards. But here's what Machiavelli had taught me that changed everything. Mercy without strength is weakness, but strength without unnecessary cruelty is true power. I didn't destroy James, though I easily could have. Instead, I offered him a choice: leave quietly with a reasonable severance or face the legal and professional consequences of his actions. The power dynamic had completely reversed. The man who'd been pulling strings behind my back was now at my mercy, and he knew it. His hands shook as he signed the separation agreement. As James packed his belongings, he looked at me with a mixture of respect and fear that I'd never seen before. For the first time in our relationship, he saw me as I truly was, not as the pushover he'd been exploiting. The transformation wasn't just professional. Word spread quickly through our industry about how I'd handled the situation. Clients who'd been wavering suddenly showed renewed confidence in my leadership. But the real change was internal. I'd learned that loneliness often comes from giving away your power to people who don't deserve it, from seeking validation instead of commanding respect. The Machiavellian psychology wasn't about becoming cruel or manipulative. It was about understanding that the world respects those who respect themselves, who set boundaries and enforce them consistently. Within 6 months, my company had doubled its revenue. I'd attracted top talent who wanted to work with someone they could respect, not someone they could walk over. My personal life transformed too. When you stop being desperate for approval, when you start valuing your own time and energy, people naturally gravitate toward your confidence. I met Sarah at a networking event 3 months later. She later told me that what attracted her wasn't my success, but the quiet strength she sensed, the way I carried myself with purpose. The old Marcus would have been desperate to impress her, would have tried too hard and ultimately pushed her away. The new Marcus simply enjoyed the conversation and let things develop naturally. Looking back, I realized that my loneliness hadn't been about lacking people in my life. It had been about lacking respect for myself, which made it impossible for others to respect me. The powerlessness I'd felt wasn't about my circumstances. It was about giving away my agency, my right to make decisions and stand by them, my responsibility to protect my own interests. Machiavelli's greatest lesson wasn't about manipulation or cruelty. It was about understanding that in a world where everyone is looking out for their own interests, you must do the same, but with wisdom and integrity. Today, I run a successful company built on mutual respect rather than exploitation. I have relationships based on genuine connection rather than desperate need for approval. The transformation from lonely and powerless to confident and respected didn't happen overnight, but it started with one crucial realization. The world doesn't owe you respect, but you owe it to yourself to demand it. But success, I learned, comes with its own set of challenges. 3 weeks after James left, I received a call that would test everything I'd learned about Machiavellian psychology in ways I never expected. The voice on the other end was smooth, calculated. It was Richard Blackwood, the CEO of Meridian Industries, our biggest competitor. He wanted to meet, and something in his tone told me this wasn't a social call. Richard had built his empire by acquiring smaller firms and absorbing their talent. He was known for making offers that seemed generous on the surface, but contained hidden clauses that destroyed the original owners. When I walked into his penthouse office, Richard greeted me with the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. He was studying me, measuring me, trying to determine if I was prey or predator. He offered me a drink, made small talk about the weather, but I could feel the tension building. This was a chess match, and he was trying to determine my opening moves before revealing his strategy. Then he dropped the bombshell. He'd been watching my company's growth, and he wanted to acquire us. The offer was substantial, enough to set me up for life, but I recognized the trap immediately. Richard's research was thorough. He knew about James, about the betrayal, about how I'd handled the situation. He was testing whether I'd learned from that experience or if I was still vulnerable to manipulation. The old Marcus would have been flattered by the attention, would have considered the offer seriously. But I'd learned to recognize when someone was trying to position themselves as my savior while planning my destruction. I asked for time to consider his proposal, knowing that delay would force him to reveal more of his hand. Desperation makes people careless, and I wanted to see how badly he needed my company. That night, I called my lawyer and my accountant. If Richard Blackwood wanted to play games, I needed to understand the rules completely. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Richard's previous acquisitions had all followed the same pattern. Generous initial offers, followed by contract modifications, then systematic dismantling of the original company's identity and leadership. But there was something else. James had been feeding Richard information about our company for months before our confrontation. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. My former partner hadn't just been planning to push me out. He'd been positioning himself as Richard's inside man, preparing to hand over everything we'd built to our biggest competitor. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Every argument James and I had about company direction, every client he'd claimed was dissatisfied, every financial concern he'd raised had been orchestrated manipulation. But anger, I'd learned, was a luxury I couldn't afford. Machiavelli taught that emotion clouds judgment, and I needed absolute clarity for what was coming next. I spent the next 48 hours crafting my response, not just to Richard's offer, but to the entire conspiracy that had been building around me for months without my knowledge. The key was understanding what Richard really wanted. It wasn't just my client list or our revenue streams. He wanted our proprietary methodology, the system we developed that gave us an edge over larger competitors. I realized that James had been slowly copying our entire operational framework, preparing to hand it over to Richard as part of their deal. My former friend wasn't just a traitor, he was a corporate spy. When Richard called for my answer, I was ready. I agreed to meet him again, but this time I controlled the location, the timing, and most importantly, the agenda. I chose a restaurant where I knew the owner, where I could ensure our conversation would be private but documented. Every word would matter in what was about to unfold. Richard arrived, expecting to close a deal with a small-time entrepreneur who'd gotten lucky. Instead, he found someone who'd done his homework and wasn't impressed by corporate intimidation tactics. I let him present his revised offer, watching as he tried to create urgency with artificial deadlines and veiled threats about market conditions. Every manipulation technique was textbook predictable. Then, I played my first card. I mentioned James by name, watching Richard's face for any tell that would confirm what I already suspected about their relationship. The slight tightening around his eyes told me everything. Richard hadn't expected me to know about James's involvement in this elaborate setup. His confidence wavered for just a moment, but it was enough. I continued eating calmly while explaining that I'd discovered the extent of their collaboration. Richard's appetite seemed to disappear as he realized his carefully laid plans were unraveling. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out a folder containing copies of every document James had stolen, every client conversation he'd recorded, every piece of proprietary information he'd copied for Richard. Richard's face went pale as he recognized his own handwriting on several documents, instructions he'd given James about what information to gather and how to position the eventual takeover. The power dynamic shifted completely in that moment. Richard realized he wasn't dealing with a naive entrepreneur anymore, but with someone who'd learned to think several moves ahead. I explained that I had copies of everything, safely stored with my lawyer, along with a detailed timeline of their conspiracy. Richard's acquisition attempt had become a potential criminal matter. But here's where Machiavelli's wisdom proved most valuable. Instead of threatening Richard with exposure, I offered him something more valuable, a way to save face while abandoning his hostile takeover. I proposed a strategic partnership instead of an acquisition. Richard could access our methodology through licensing agreements, while I maintained control of my company and its future direction. The beauty of this approach was that it gave Richard what he actually needed while protecting what I'd built. It was a solution that served both our interests without destroying either of us. Richard agreed to the partnership, but more importantly, he agreed to cut all ties with James and provide testimony about their conspiracy if needed. My former partner's betrayal had finally caught up with him. As we left the restaurant, Richard looked at me with genuine respect for the first time. He'd come expecting to devour a smaller competitor and instead found an equal who'd outmaneuvered him completely. The partnership announcement sent shockwaves through our industry. Competitors who'd been circling like vultures suddenly realized that my company wasn't vulnerable prey, but a formidable force. James tried to contact me when he heard about the partnership, probably realizing that his bridge burning had left him completely isolated. I didn't return his calls. Some betrayals don't deserve second chances. Within a month, our partnership had generated more revenue than my company had ever seen. Richard's resources, combined with our innovation, created opportunities neither of us could have achieved alone. But the real victory wasn't financial. I'd learned that true power comes not from destroying your enemies, but from turning potential threats into allies while maintaining your principles and protecting what matters most. 6 months into our partnership with Meridian Industries, I thought I had finally mastered the game. My company was thriving, my reputation was solid, and I believed I understood how power truly worked in the corporate world. That confidence shattered on a rainy Thursday morning when my assistant rushed into my office, her face pale with panic. She handed me a newspaper with trembling hands, and what I saw made my blood freeze. The headline screamed across the business section, "Corporate Espionage Scandal Rocks Industry." Below it was a photo of me shaking hands with Richard, but the story painted us as co-conspirators in a massive fraud scheme. According to the article, someone had leaked documents suggesting that our partnership was built on stolen intellectual property and that we had systematically destroyed smaller competitors through illegal means. My phone started ringing immediately. Clients demanding explanations, lawyers offering services, reporters seeking comments. The carefully constructed reputation I had built was crumbling in real time. But the worst call came from Richard himself. His voice was ice cold as he informed me that he was suspending our partnership pending a full investigation. He spoke as if I were a stranger, not an ally. Within hours, federal investigators arrived at my office with search warrants. They seized computers, files, and documents while my employees watched in stunned silence. I felt like a criminal in my own company. That night, alone in my apartment, I realized that someone had orchestrated this entire scenario with surgical precision. This wasn't random bad luck. It was a calculated assassination of my character and business. The question that haunted me was simple. Who had the access, the motivation, and the sophistication to pull off such an elaborate frame job? The answer came to me like a punch to the gut. James. My former partner hadn't disappeared after our confrontation. He had been planning his revenge, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy everything I had built from the shadows. I called my lawyer immediately, but even she sounded uncertain. The evidence against me appeared substantial, and the media narrative was already set. Fighting this would require resources I wasn't sure I had. The next morning brought worse news. 3 major clients had terminated their contracts, citing the scandal as grounds for immediate cancellation. My revenue stream was evaporating before my eyes. My employees started avoiding eye contact in the hallways. IBM had already begun updating their resumes, preparing to abandon what they now saw as a sinking ship. The isolation was suffocating. But then I remembered something crucial that Machiavelli had written. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. The truth was still on my side, even if appearances weren't. I began my own investigation, starting with the leaked documents. If James had orchestrated this, he would have left traces. Revenge makes people sloppy, and I needed to find his mistakes. The breakthrough came when I discovered that several of the leaked documents contained metadata showing they had been accessed from James's old company laptop, which he had supposedly returned months ago. But James was smarter than I had given him credit for. He had covered his tracks well, using intermediaries and anonymous sources to distance himself from the leak. Proving his involvement would be nearly impossible. That's when I realized I was thinking about this all wrong. I didn't need to prove James's guilt in court. I needed to make him reveal himself through his own arrogance and desire for revenge. I crafted a plan that would require me to appear vulnerable while actually setting a trap. It was risky, but desperation had made me willing to gamble everything on one final move. I leaked information through carefully chosen channels that I was considering bankruptcy, that the investigation had broken me, and that I was ready to sell everything and disappear from the industry forever. The bait worked perfectly. Within 48 hours, James reached out through a mutual contact, expressing his concern for my situation and offering to meet for coffee to discuss potential solutions. When James walked into the coffee shop, he couldn't hide his satisfaction. He thought he was meeting with a broken man, someone he had finally defeated after months of careful planning. He played his role perfectly, offering condolences about my unfortunate situation, while barely suppressing his glee. Every word confirmed what I had suspected about his involvement in my downfall. But James's arrogance was his weakness. He began dropping hints about information he shouldn't have known, details about the investigation that hadn't been made public, evidence of his inside knowledge. I let him talk, recording every word on my phone while maintaining the appearance of a defeated victim seeking guidance from an old friend. His ego made him careless with his secrets. The moment I had been waiting for came when James offered to help me by connecting me with someone who could make the investigation disappear for the right price. He was offering to fix the problem he had created. That's when I knew I had him. James had just confessed to having connections with the people behind my frame job, essentially admitting his role in orchestrating the entire scandal. I thanked James for his generous offer and promised to consider it carefully. He left the coffee shop believing he had won completely, unaware that he had just handed me the key to his destruction. That evening, I met with my lawyer and played the recording. Her expression shifted from concern to amazement as she realized what we had captured. James had given us everything we needed, but I wasn't finished. The recording proved James's involvement, but I needed to expose the full scope of his conspiracy and clear my name completely. Half measures wouldn't be enough. I reached out to the journalist who had broken the original story, offering an exclusive interview about the real conspiracy behind the scandal. Truth, I had learned, could be just as powerful as lies when properly presented. The journalist was skeptical at first, but when I played James' recording and showed her the metadata evidence, her investigative instincts took over. She smelled a bigger story than the one she had originally reported. Within a week, the follow-up article appeared with an even bigger headline: "The Frame Job: How Corporate Revenge Nearly Destroyed an Innocent CEO." The tables had turned completely. James's world collapsed overnight. The recording was played on business news channels. His reputation was destroyed, and several companies announced they were reviewing their relationships with him. My clients began calling to apologize and restore their contracts. The federal investigation was quietly dropped, and Richard reached out to discuss resuming our partnership on even better terms. But the most satisfying moment came when James called me directly, his voice shaking with rage and desperation. He accused me of entrapment, of manipulation, of being everything he claimed to despise. I listened to his rant calmly, then reminded him of something he had forgotten. In a world where everyone is playing games, the person who plays them best isn't the villain. They're simply the one who refuses to be the victim. The victory over James felt complete, but I was about to learn that in the world of corporate warfare, every triumph creates new enemies. 3 days after the story broke, I received a package with no return address. Inside were photographs of me entering and leaving various locations over the past month, along with a single-typed note that made my hands shake. "You destroyed the wrong person. Now it's your turn." The photos were professional quality, taken with expensive equipment by someone who had been watching me for weeks. This wasn't James seeking revenge. This was something far more dangerous. I immediately called my security consultant, a former FBI agent named Patricia, who specialized in corporate threats. Her voice was grim as she examined the evidence I'd received. Patricia's analysis was chilling. The surveillance pattern suggested multiple operatives, sophisticated equipment, and unlimited resources. Someone with serious money wanted me eliminated from the business world permanently. The realization hit me like ice water. Richard Blackwood. Our partnership had been profitable, but I had humiliated him during our initial negotiations. Some powerful men never forgive being outmaneuvered, but confronting Richard directly would be suicide. If he was behind this campaign of intimidation, he would simply deny everything while escalating his attacks through untraceable intermediaries. Patricia recommended immediate relocation and a low profile, but running would mean abandoning everything I had built. The old Marcus might have fled, but I had learned too much about power to surrender now. Instead, I decided to use Richard's own tactics against him. If he wanted to play games in the shadows, I would drag our conflict into the light, where his reputation was vulnerable. I reached out to investigative journalists who specialized in corporate corruption, offering them exclusive access to document our partnership and any irregularities they might discover. The journalists were initially skeptical, but when I showed them the surveillance photos and explained the pattern of intimidation, their interest sharpened. They smelled a major story about corporate bullying. Meanwhile, I implemented Patricia's security recommendations while maintaining my normal business routine. If Richard wanted to intimidate me, he would find that I refused to be driven into hiding. The psychological pressure was intense. Every phone call could be a threat. Every meeting could be a trap. Every shadow could hide someone watching me. But I had learned that fear was just another form of manipulation. 2 weeks into the investigation, the journalists made a breakthrough. They discovered that Richard's company had used similar intimidation tactics against 3 other competitors over the past 5 years. The pattern was clear: surveillance, threats, character assassination, and finally hostile takeovers of weakened companies. I wasn't Richard's first target. I was just his most recent victim. But the other victims had all eventually surrendered, selling their companies for fractions of their worth or simply closing down under pressure. None had fought back effectively. Armed with this evidence, I made a decision that would have terrified the old Marcus. I called Richard directly and requested a private meeting, knowing he would interpret this as surrender. Richard agreed immediately, probably expecting to dictate terms to a broken opponent. He suggested his private club, a location where he would feel completely in control and untouchable. When I arrived, Richard was waiting with his lawyer and what appeared to be a prepared acquisition offer. He genuinely believed that intimidation had succeeded where negotiation had failed. I sat down calmly and placed a tablet on the table, then pressed play. The room filled with recorded conversations between Richard and his security contractors, discussing surveillance operations and intimidation tactics. Richard's face went white as he heard his own voice instructing operatives to make life uncomfortable for me until I agreed to sell my company at his preferred price. His lawyer immediately began damage control, claiming the recordings were taken out of context, but I had hours of material documenting a systematic campaign of corporate terrorism. Then I revealed the journalists' investigation, explaining that Richard's pattern of intimidation against multiple companies was about to become front-page news across the business world. The power dynamic shifted completely. Richard, who had entered expecting to dictate terms to a defeated opponent, now faced potential criminal charges and the destruction of his reputation. But I wasn't interested in destroying Richard, despite having the power to do so. Machiavelli had taught me that the most effective victories leave your opponents grateful for your mercy. I offered Richard a choice: end all surveillance and intimidation immediately, provide OGT, a written apology, and continue our legitimate business partnership, or face public exposure and criminal investigation. Richard signed the agreement without hesitation, his hands shaking as he realized how completely he had underestimated the man he had tried to intimidate into submission. As we left the club, Richard looked at me with something approaching awe. He had tried to destroy me using fear and intimidation, only to discover that I had become immune to such tactics. The journalists published a sanitized version of the story, focusing on corporate intimidation tactics without naming Richard specifically. The message was clear: such behavior would no longer be tolerated. My company's reputation soared as word spread that I had successfully defended against a major corporation's intimidation campaign. Clients saw strength and integrity, exactly what they wanted in a partner. But the real transformation was internal. I had faced the ultimate test of everything Machiavelli had taught me about power, strategy, and human nature, and I had emerged victorious. The loneliness that had once consumed me was gone, replaced by genuine relationships built on mutual respect rather than desperate need for approval or fear of abandonment. Sarah and I had grown closer through the crisis, and she later told me that watching me handle the pressure with integrity had convinced her that I was someone she could build a future with. My business partnership with Richard became stronger than ever, built now on mutual respect rather than manipulation. He had learned that I was an equal, not a target for exploitation. Looking back, I realized that Machiavelli's greatest lesson wasn't about manipulation or cruelty. It was about understanding that respect must be earned through strength, wisdom, and unwavering principles. The powerlessness and loneliness that had once defined my life were gone forever, replaced by the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever challenges life presents. Today, I share this story not to glorify conflict, but to show that true power comes from self-respect, strategic thinking, and the courage to stand up for what you've built. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content about building genuine confidence and success. Share your own transformation stories in the comments below.